I'm going to talk about a lot of things tonight that I think are true. But I want to begin with a story that I'm pretty sure isn't. A man woke up one morning convinced that he was dead. And he came out to his wife and informed her that he was dead. And she pointed out the obvious flaw that he was telling her he was dead. And that's probably not plausible, but he was adamant, for some reason, was convinced that he had in fact died. Nothing she could do all day could convince him that he was actually alive. And she, in her frustration, got to the point where they invited a friend over that evening who was a doctor, a medical doctor, who brought with him the textbooks from university and sat down with this friend and tried to convince him that he really wasn't dead. He couldn't be dead. And he had the great idea, this doctor, that he would go to the section on death in the medical textbook and make the indisputable point that dead people don't bleed. He pointed the evidence that with the heart stopping and the blood coagulating, people who are dead do not bleed. At which point the man got to the point where he said, yes, I can see the evidence is clear. Dead people, they don't bleed. So what? The doctor got a little pin and jabbed it in the guy's arm and blood spurt everywhere. And the man looked at his arm and said, well, what do you know? Dead people do bleed after all. Okay, very kind of you to laugh. It's untrue, but it illustrates something that is true and relevant to what I want to say. And that is not that the evidence for the resurrection is equal to the scientific evidence for blood flow, but that people don't make their minds up about big things based only on evidence. There can be strong, robust evidence for something, and people still hold their view, because in the end, we make up our minds about important topics based on a mix of evidence, but also assumptions and experiences, preferences and prejudices. And I say this because the rest of my talk really is about evidence. And I don't want you to have the impression from me that I think laying out historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus settles the matter. I think it's worth a half-hour talk, maybe 37 minutes, but I don't think it is life-changing. I don't think people make up their minds based only on evidence. I want to begin the talk proper with a quotation that is very interesting, especially when I tell you who wrote these words. Concerning the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday, I was for decades a denier. I am no longer a denier, since the following deliberation has caused me to think this through anew. When these peasants, shepherds and fishermen who betrayed and denied their master and then failed him miserably suddenly could be changed overnight into a confident mission society, convinced of salvation and able to work with much more success after Easter than before Easter, then no hallucination or vision is sufficient to explain such a revolutionary transformation. If the defeated and depressed group of disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith based only on autosuggestion or self-deception without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. In a purely logical analysis, the resurrection of Jesus is the lesser of two evils for all those who seek a rational explanation of the worldwide consequences of that Easter faith. These words were not penned by a clergyman or a Christian apologist or a Christian of any kind, but in fact by the late, great Pinchas Lapid, professor of Jewish history at Bar Ilan University in Israel, very important Jewish historian contributing to our knowledge of antiquity. And he is also an Orthodox Jew. But he, as an historian, thought he would try his hand at an analysis of the resurrection and concluded Jesus likely actually rose again. And the last third of the book is fascinating. It is an explanation of why this doesn't mean he's going to change his mind about Christianity. And it's an ingenious insight that leads him to the point where he can simultaneously say Jesus rose again as a historical fact, but I'm remaining an Orthodox Jew who doesn't believe he is the Messiah. Now, quoting Pinchas Lapide is not probative of anything. It is, however, illustrative of something really important and a well-kept secret. And that is that the resurrection of Jesus remains an important, serious topic of historical inquiry by those who aren't Christians. It isn't just Christians pondering the resurrection. There are people who avowedly are not, who nonetheless think we have the kind of evidence that makes this mysterious at the very least. And for someone like Pinchas Lapide and plenty of others who aren't Christians, they nonetheless think something weird happened. We are not talking about something that happened in Middle Earth, the land of the Hobbit and so on. What we're talking about is something to do with the history of the Middle East. When I started my historical studies way back in 1996, there were already 94 peer-reviewed monographs and articles on the resurrection of Jesus. This is not theology. These were historical, critical analyses of the resurrection. I think in the 30 years since then, that number will have tripled. It remains a really important topic of inquiry. The Resurrection is a book collecting the papers of an Oxford University symposium on the resurrection, where they invited historians and scientists and philosophers, and they even let a theologian in to talk about the resurrection from all those different angles and published the papers. One of the most significant books to be written is this one on the screen, The 800-Page Monster by N.T. Wright. It is really quite something. The 2004 book, The Resurrection of Christ, Historical Inquiry, written by the atheist German New Testament historian Gerd Ludemann. Then there's the 2008 The Resurrection by Geza Vermesh, the professor of Jewish studies at Oxford University. In 2019, another really important historical volume by Bruce Chilton, Resurrection Logic, How Jesus' First Followers Believed God Raised Him from the Dead. And the most recent one is in 2021 by Dale Allison, The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, and History. It's a special book because Allison is renowned, one of the top tier scholars in the world today, and he is renowned for criticizing both Christian apologists and arbitrary skeptics. His beef with Christian apologists is they think they can prove too much. They go beyond the evidence. The problem with arbitrary skeptics is that they are arbitrary skeptics, and when it comes to the resurrection, they don't apply the normal rules of history. It's a really interesting book, and I'll tell you something about his conclusion in a moment. Allison speaks about the rules of history, and I want to say something about the rules of history. In fact, to give you a sense of what I want to do tonight, I want to give you 1 point of philosophy, 4 rules of history, and 2 facts of the resurrection. I know it sounds like I have 7 points. Just think of it as 3. Right? It'll flow much better. So let me say something about philosophy, because I don't think it all comes down to evidence. Let me say the philosophical thing is this. Following David Hume's famous attempt, the great Enlightenment atheist philosopher, his really widely read attempt to debunk miracles, there's been a kind of 250-year debate amongst philosophers about whether it's plausible, rational to believe in miracles, or even the possibility of miracles. And I think it's fair to say both sides of the debate have settled in a kind of begrudging stalemate, because they've worked out that actually the rationality or otherwise of believing in the resurrection boils down to background beliefs, not simple evidence. What kind of universe do you think we're living in? One where resurrection could take place, or one where it couldn't take place. And the background belief informs how you read the evidence. So to lay it out in a way that I think is simple and philosophically responsible, if I hold that the laws of nature define the limits of what's possible in the universe, that no lawgiver, no God exists behind the laws, then in principle, miracles cannot be viewed as rational, and no amount of evidence could be accepted as evidence that a miracle has taken place. You see, my background belief about the kind of universe we're in means that it doesn't matter what pile of evidence you might give me, I can't accept it, because I know that resurrections don't take place. But what if we flip this around? What if I hold that the laws of nature do not define the limits of what's possible in the universe, that the laws themselves point to a lawgiver or God behind the laws? Then, since such a lawgiver could act through and beyond the natural laws, it is rational to believe in the possibility of miracles, and I am free to accept a miracle when there is good evidence in its favour. Which is really to say, if I believe in a completely naturalistic universe with no God, of course, it doesn't matter how much evidence there is for a resurrection, you can't accept it. But if you are someone who thinks there's a mind behind the universe, then at least you have the mental framework to be in a position to assess evidence, if that evidence is indeed there. Which of course raises the question, what kind of evidence would a miracle like the resurrection of Jesus leave behind? It's a good question. Thank you for asking it. The simple answer to the question, what kind of evidence would the resurrection leave behind? Here's a really important philosophical distinction. It would leave historical evidence behind, not scientific evidence. Science deals with the mathematical, the observable, and the repeatable. And within this sphere, we all agree science is brilliant. But science can make no claim about historical events. It makes no sense to demand scientific evidence for all kinds of knowledge. Otherwise, we rule out most legal knowledge, most historical knowledge. I mean, you think about courts of law. Yes, occasionally they use science, DNA samples and that sort of thing, but mostly legal judgment is based on the assessment of testimony. Most legal judgments come down to testimony. History is like legal judgment. Most history is decided not on scientific things, but on testimony, the assessment of testimony. If the testimony is weighty, we can make confident judgments. If it's weak, well, we can't. And when you think about it, we're all depending on testimony all the time. It's a really important philosophical book by a Melbourne University philosopher. It's not in any way a Christian philosophy. Tony Cody, his book, Testimony, a Philosophical Study, he actually points out that virtually everything we know outside of the specialty you know directly, you only know because you believe the person who taught you. I'd venture to say virtually everything you think you know about history, you only know because you trust either something you read in a book or the teacher who told you. Virtually everything about English literature, geography, unless you're a world traveller, politics, art, the news, even science. What Tony Cody does here is he demonstrates that actually most scientists know their field directly. Yeah, they might be a microbiologist, and so they've looked down the microscope at the cells themselves, but they have never actually done the experiments for, say, Big Bang cosmology. They just read the papers and trust the people. They're actually trusting testimony. And of course, my point is that the resurrection of Jesus Christ falls into the category of a historical event, not a scientific inquiry. And historical events are, by definition, unrepeatable, unseen, untouched. They are known through testimony. And of course, if the testimony is weak, you can dismiss it. If the testimony is strong, you've got to grapple with it. So the next good question is, what constitutes good historical evidence? Which brings me to my 4 rules of history. What I mean by rules is not that, when we join the Historians Club, we have to sign the approved rules. I don't really mean that. I mean general principles that all historians, whether they're working on modern European history or ancient history, they all pretty much agree with 4 principles that really are just common sense. Principle number 1, sources written close in time to the events are less likely to contain legendary embellishment. That's just common sense. You would have made that up yourself. You wouldn't have called it a rule of history, you just call it common sense. Historians can sometimes have common sense, and they apply this all the time. If your first piece of evidence for something comes from 100 years after the event, there's no mention of it before that, you are right to be a little bit skeptical, because that's a long time and embellishments can come along. But something written within the living memory of an event, that's different. And the point that I would raise here is that everyone agrees the New Testament passes this test with flying colours. All of the New Testament documents are written within living memory of the events that they tell. And as far as ancient history goes, that's pretty good. Rule number 2 is that events recorded in 2 or more separate sources are more plausible than events recorded in just one source. And again, this is no different from if you leave here tonight and you hear some very strange news from one friend, you may or may not believe it. Depends on how much you trust the friend, actually. But if you hear the same news from a different person and you're pretty sure that person didn't get it from the first person, you're starting to apply the criterion of multiple attestation, is what historians call it, but you would just call it common sense. Things reported in multiple sources tend to take on greater plausibility. And the New Testament passes with flying colours here. We have at least 3, likely 7, separate sources now bundled into the book we call the New Testament. Third rule of history. Authors in a position to know the information they report are more valuable than authors who record unsourced hearsay. A lot of ancient history is unsourced hearsay. We read a source written 150, 200 years after the event. I think of Philostratus's biography of Apollonius of Tyana. Okay, an important philosophical figure. Well, we have no reason to think that there are any reports that the writer 120 years after Apollonius' death had access to any of the information that existed. It seems like he's not in a position to know anything directly about 120 years earlier. In the case of the New Testament, we do have several eyewitness authors. We have authors, quite a few, who knew the eyewitnesses and are reporting, like a modern journalist actually, directly from people who knew the events. So our New Testament passes this test with flying colours. Fourth, testimony given against interest is generally more believable than testimony given for benefit. I mean, in a court of law, when we learn that a witness benefits from the testimony that they're giving in court, we can be a little bit suspicious, right? I mean, I've seen Law and Order, right, and have spoken to judges and lawyers, and it is the case. When there's a great benefit in the testimony, you can be suspicious. But what if someone is giving testimony that makes them look bad, that actually their testimony is to their own detriment? This is called evidence against interest, or the criterion of embarrassment. And the New Testament passes this with flying colours, because one of the clearest things about the early Christians is they didn't benefit from their claim. I mean, you could say, oh, but they thought they were going to heaven. I mean, they didn't benefit with money and, the Vatican and power or anything like that. Okay. With this one philosophical point in place and these 4 rules or general principles of history in place, we are in a good place to talk about the facts of the resurrection. And there are 2 that are widely agreed upon by scholars, whether they are Christian, atheist, Jewish, or whatever. And I want to lay out those 2 facts and why most scholars think these 2 facts are indeed facts about the resurrection. They may or may not point to an actual resurrection because, of course, more is going on here than mere facts. But these facts, they are the topic of conversation to this day. Number 1, the tomb in which Jesus was laid was very probably found empty. You might look at that and go, hang on, aren't you at Wheaton College? What are you talking about probably? I mean, don't we just believe the Bible? Well, yes. Okay, I mean, I'm a Bible believer, but, my PhD is in ancient history, and this is how ancient history works in sort of probabilities. So I can say as a historical statement that the tomb in which Jesus was laid was very probably found empty. It's not a claim of Christian apologists. This is a claim, an observation made by the likes of Gezer Vermesh, professor of Jewish studies, one of the most important Jewish historians of the last 50 years. And he wrote, from these various records, two reasonably convincing points merge. One positive and the other negative. First, the women belonging to the entourage of Jesus discovered an empty tomb and were definite that it was the tomb. Second, the rumour that the apostles stole the body is most improbable. The most rigorous analysis of this question of an empty tomb has been offered by Dale Allison, whom I mentioned before, who's so fascinating because he's both against Christian apologetics and against arbitrary skepticism. And just he plots this path right down the middle, a sort of rigorous, detailed path of just assessing evidence. But in the end, he comes to the conclusion there was very likely an empty tomb. There are three reasons. One, the empty tomb is mentioned in three separate sources. That is, sources not copied from one another. And that counts because that's one of our rules of history. Two, there is evidence that the Jerusalem elite, immediately after the resurrection, claimed the disciples stole Jesus' body from the tomb. We have at least two sources that refer to the Jerusalem leaders saying, you disciples stole the body from the tomb. Now, what the historian does is pauses there and go, okay, maybe the disciples did steal the body from the tomb, but this is pretty good evidence that there was an empty tomb. The fact that there's a debate about how it got that way is proof that it got that way. This is how the historian approaches this. The third reason the empty tomb is taken very seriously may not sound very potent in a modern context, but it's that the testimony about the discovery of the empty tomb came from women. And you might think, well, so what? Well, in antiquity, a woman's testimony was not highly valued, I'm sorry to say, to every woman here. But we have primary source evidence from the period, such as Josephus. From women let no evidence be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their sex. I apologise, women in the building. I'm just reporting what Josephus said. Or from the Mishnah. The law governing an oath of testimony applies to men and not to women, to those who are suitable to bear witness and not to those who are unsuitable to bear witness. Again, I'm so sorry. I double-checked that this isn't just Christian apologetics. I recently got to interview Richard Bauckham, who is also at the very top of the tree, formerly at St Andrews University, now at Cambridge University, and one of the most lauded experts of the last 30 years. And I just wanted to quiz him, hang on, this point about women discovering the tomb, do you think it's historically relevant or not?
People often raise the fact that it was women who were the first witnesses of the empty tomb strengthens slightly the claim, because women weren't taken that seriously, so you wouldn't invent women as the best witnesses. Is that more than mere apologetics? Do you think there's something sort of historically forceful there?
Yes, I think there is something. People sometimes say that women's testimony wasn't very much valued in court, and that is probably something in that. But I think much more significant, actually, is that women were regarded as gullible in matters of religion. One early critic of Christianity, a man called Celsus, we have pretty large extracts from his work, and he said, so who were the witnesses to this? One poor fisherman and one hysterical woman.
He wouldn't get well along in this world today.
No, but that was a common opinion, and I think it's significant that it was particularly in matters of religion that women were thought to be gullible. Quite know why that was, but it does seem to have been a fact.
And of course, the historical point is, if you were making up a story that you wanted your comrades to believe, would you make women the key eyewitnesses to the discovery of the empty tomb? No. Unless it was just somewhat awkwardly true. And it actually created headaches for early Christianity that women were at the centre of this story. Of course they were, people like Celsus said. So that's the empty tomb. But I'm conscious that an empty tomb can be interpreted in multiple ways, including the disciples stole the body. So actually, it's this first fact, the tomb in which Jesus was laid was very probably found empty, combined with a second fact that actually leaves historians to this day still puzzling this through, still writing books and articles about the history of the resurrection. The second fact is this: from the beginning, people claimed in good faith to be eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus. Now that is very carefully worded. From the beginning, people claimed in good faith to have seen the risen Jesus. Our evidence for this fact, this fact is not saying it's a fact that Jesus rose. Don't mishear me. I'm saying it's a fact that people from the beginning said they had seen him. And furthermore, that we can be pretty confident they were sincere in the claim. That's the fact that's there, the claim of the resurrection. Our evidence for this is widespread, early, unexpected, and sincere. Let me talk about this. Just when you thought there were only 7 points, there are 4 under my 7th point. Widespread. All I mean here is there are plenty of places we could turn to discover that the earliest witnesses thought they saw him. Every one of the 27 books of the New Testament make this clear. Again, it's not proof that he rose again, but it is proof that the people there at the time thought that he had been raised to life. 4 or 5 of these are independent sources. Virtually every specialist in the world today accepts as fact that people from the beginning thought they had seen him alive from the dead. The most important of all the texts is this one. And the bit in yellow is universally regarded as a creed that Paul quotes in his letter to the Corinthians. Paul writes in about the year 55 to the Corinthians, but he's citing a creed that we can date within a couple of years of the events themselves. In this creedal statement that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12, we find the core of the early testimony about Jesus' resurrection. And it is incredibly early. We can date this yellow bit. The reasons are technical. You can ask me in the question time if you want. But we know when Paul received this creed as a convert, because we know the date of his conversion. So we can either date this to 31-32 in Damascus or 33-34 in Jerusalem. Either way, pretty early. And it isn't Christian apologists who point this out. Here are 2 skeptical scholars, Gerd Ludemann, openly an atheist, Robert Funk, openly an agnostic, who both agree with what I'm saying right now, that this statement in yellow can be dated to within months or maybe a few years of the claimed event itself. What's the significance of that? It means virtually everyone working on this topic says it is impossible to dismiss the resurrection as a late accumulating legend. Like in the earliest stages, Jesus was just killed. And as the decades rolled on and people really forgot and there were no eyewitnesses, people said he must have been raised to life because he was so special. No one thinks that. It's impossible. Because if this creed was, let's even put it at the year 35, if this was in wide circulation as a summary of the Christian faith by the year 35, it means that Jesus' status as Messiah, Christos, his death for sins, his burial in a tomb, his resurrection on the 3rd day, and his appearance to Peter and to the 12 were already sufficiently well known to be in a formal statement of the Christian faith that early. Why do I say that the evidence for the eyewitnesses is unexpected? And I say this because 2 of our eyewitnesses were not believers when they got their alleged appearance. People sometimes have said to me over the years, why was it only Christians that ever saw the risen Jesus? That's a good question, I guess. They say, why didn't non-Christians? If non-Christians had seen the risen Jesus, then I'd believe it. Well, at least in two cases, two very important cases, there were people who weren't Christians, opposed to the Christian faith, who saw Jesus. The problem is they then became Christians. But then you lose your argument. It isn't that they were Christians and so they believed in the resurrection. They came to realize the resurrection and believed in Jesus. One, of course, is James, the brother of Jesus. We have excellent evidence that James did not believe in Jesus, actually thought Jesus was crazy during his lifetime. But James, the brother of Jesus, received his own appearance and eventually became the leader of the Jerusalem church. And we have extra biblical evidence that James, the brother of Jesus, was in fact executed for his testimony about his brother in the year 62 in Jerusalem. The other is Paul, of course, whose eyewitness writings we actually possess in our hot little hands today. He was an opponent of the Christian faith and had some kind of encounter. This is why I say it's unexpected. There are many more things I could say about how unexpected it was, but that'll do. Why do I say sincere? Or in the language I've got there in the heading, in good faith. Virtually everyone working on the problem of the resurrection today agrees these witnesses were utterly sincere. Maybe they were crazy, but they were sincere. And the reason is straightforward. If these witnesses gained money and honour and land and power through their claims, we would have every right to be suspicious. But one of the things that we can prove beyond doubting is that these eyewitnesses did not make it rich through their claims, did not get land or power or honour. In fact, quite the opposite. They consistently were socially estranged, lost honour, lost property and religious status. They were imprisoned, they were whipped. We have very clear evidence of the execution of at least 4. Now, sometimes Christian apologists exaggerate and say all the apostles were killed. I'm willing to say we have very good evidence that at least 4 of the original eyewitnesses were executed for their claim. Now, it's true that devotees die for things they merely believe in, right? I mean, that happens all the time. A martyr for a faith, it's a common thing. But that's a totally different category. These were the people who knew if it were made up or not. And they died for their faith. These are the people who said, I saw him. And they gave their life. Who dies for what they know to be a lie? Does this prove the resurrection? No. It probably proves that they thought they had seen Jesus. Because who dies for what they know to be a fabrication? Thus, even someone like Ed Sanders of Duke University, who recently passed away, very sad, but a really important scholar, somewhat agnostic, highly skeptical, he wrote this: I do not regard deliberate fraud as a worthwhile explanation. Many of the people in these lists of witnesses were to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming that they had seen the risen Lord, and several of them would die for their cause. So here is where historical analysis leads us. Very probably an empty tomb. Definitely multiple people from the beginning thought they saw him, sincerely. They're the 2 facts of the resurrection. That's where history leads us. But it's also where history leaves us. Because how we go on from those 2 facts really isn't dependent on historical analysis. It's really more philosophical or personal. It's got to do with preferences. And you know what? In the field, most specialists get to the point of agreeing with those 2 facts and then don't try and explain it. So there's E.P. Sanders I just quoted. Here's a really interesting statement. I've always loved quoting this because it shows you what a responsible historian will do who's also a little bit skeptical about the Christian faith. That Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. Something very weird happened. It's above my pay grade to tell you what it was. That's what he's saying. Same conclusion reached by Gezer Vermesh. As I said, professor, Jewish studies, one of the great translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls, brilliant. He'd written 8 books on Jesus. I mean, he'd written so many books, but 8 of them were on Jesus. I don't know how you do that, but as a Jew, a sort of secular Jew, he was not deeply religious. But then he published his last book in 2008 on the resurrection. And the thing is, we all rushed out and bought this book because we had little hints in his earlier books about what he thought of the resurrection. And he'd sort of hinted, very likely an empty tomb, hinted that the disciples really thought they'd seen him. So we all rushed out to read the full volume. And basically, he just spent 250 pages saying what he'd said in the previous 8 books. But he said it with great eloquence. And what was so fascinating, he gets to the end of the book and says what I've said to you tonight. There was an empty tomb. They definitely thought they saw him. Yeah, so? You turn over and there's an epilogue that runs through 6 possible natural explanations of these 2 facts. And one by one he says, that won't work, that won't work, that won't work, that won't work. So then I turn over the page to read, well, what is the explanation? And it's blank. Which is to say, we have the kind of historical evidence a resurrection would leave behind. And much more evidence pointing in that direction than we would expect if it were a mistake or a legend or a fraud. Now, of course, if I don't believe there's a mind behind the laws of nature, it doesn't matter how good the evidence is. I'm not going to conclude from this there was a resurrection. My background assumption drives what I do with the evidence. It's always the case. But if I do believe there's a mind behind the universe who could, in principle, work in and through and beyond the laws of nature to raise someone from the dead, then in one case in history, I have an example that looks like the kind of historical evidence a resurrection would leave behind. The resurrection isn't really a historical problem. I've often thought if the central claim of Christianity was not that Jesus rose again, but that Jesus was just really strong and moved the stone himself and beat up the Roman soldiers and then went and lived down in Alexandria for the rest of his life with his little platoon of soldiers or something. That would be a unique story from ancient history. There would be nothing like it in ancient history. But no one would doubt it. If we had the same level of early widespread evidence for strongman Jesus that we do for the resurrection, no one would doubt it. But here we have a miracle, and so it goes beyond our historical findings. We are pressed into thinking, what do we think about the universe we're living in? And more than that, what about my preferences, my biases, my prejudices, and so on? Let me close by saying something on that personal side of the resurrection, but how it often pairs with the intellectual dimension. I just want to give you an example from my own life and ministry experience of watching someone very high intellect navigate the question of the resurrection with their own personal foibles and insights. I may have mentioned this to some of you before. I became very friendly with a state judge in Australia, James Garbutt. I met him because he turned up at my church. He wasn't a regular at all, but he turned up at the 8 a.m. service. I happened to be preaching, so I saw him. I went up to him straight afterwards. And he said, look, you're going to be a bit skeptical, but I've just received a terrible cancer diagnosis. They think I have months. And I thought to myself, I should go and check out church. Now, I know you're going to be cynical, he started to say to me. And I'm not cynical. I said, it's fantastic that you're here. And he said to me, look, as skeptical as people might be about man gets cancer, turns up at church, the cancer diagnosis told me that I really had to assess what's important in life. And he said only 2 things, really. If God is true, I want to know about it, and my family. That's it. So that's why I'm here. And so began the most delightful series of afternoon teas with James. He lived just around the corner from the church, and I would turn up in the afternoon, and we'd have these wonderful conversations, only intellectual at the beginning. He was a very smart man. He'd spent 30 years on the bench. He'd been assessing good and bad arguments all his professional life. And he wants to know about the Trinity and predestination and resurrection and the whole show. I gave him some sort of homework to do, to read some articles and books, but most of all to read the Gospels. I said, look, you've been judging testimony for 30 years on the bench. How about you just read the testimony of the Gospels and see what you think? See what's there. A couple of more afternoon teas later, I'm chatting with him, and we were chatting about how similar his legal discipline is to my historical discipline. Because in the end, they're both about weighing testimony. And he said to me one day, I've read those Gospels. There's lots I don't know how to interpret, but I've really focused in on that last bit, the resurrection bit. And he said to me, there is no way that's made up. This is good testimony. And I know good testimony, he said. At that point, our conversation started to turn from the merely intellectual to the personal. He wanted to know what it meant, if it were true. And he came to the point where he believed intellectually that Jesus rose again. But more than that, he believed that if Jesus rose again and he depended on Jesus, he would live eternally. James died. But I remember seeing him just 3 days before he died in hospital. He was being beautifully cared for by the staff, but he was in that sort of morphine sleepiness to keep the pain at bay, but try and keep him conscious at the same time. I walked into the hospital room and I said, James, it's John. And he shot his hand up to grab hold of my hand. And I said, do you want me to pray? And he said, yes, and I prayed with him. And by the time I got to the Amen, very ordinary prayer, he was back asleep. He was asleep. So I left, and 3 days later, the family rang me to say he's passed away. The family also asked me if I would lead the funeral, that James had insisted I lead the funeral. So it was a great privilege of my life. This Sydney church at that funeral was filled, packed to the rafters, with the legal fraternity of Sydney. There were other judges and legal boffins and academics and so on. And they decided, unwisely I think, to have 5 eulogies. And just a hot tip from a pro, that's too many. Okay. Anyway, they had 5. Every one of them said something to the effect of, James Garbutt was a man of impeccable judgment. That was the expression they kept on using. He was like famous in the New South Wales courts for just being able to see the truth in a situation and making a wise judgment. Anyway, person after person after person, impeccable judgment, impeccable judgment. So of course I changed my sermon after hearing all this, and I had to just say, look, you've told us how impeccable was his judgment. Let me tell you about his final legal judgment. He judged the testimony of the Gospels to be not made up, to be fair-minded, to be sincere. He died believing in the resurrection. Now, I can't say that the audience thought anything of it after that day, but I came away thrilled and challenged at the thought that you can bring your whole mind to the question of the resurrection as an intellectual, and you will find satisfying data there. But it's not probative. James, in the end, thought there's no way this is made up. But then he entered into the story and found himself depending on the risen Jesus, not just thinking it's likely that he rose again. And that's the difference between mere intellect and Christian faith. You don't have to switch your brain off, but it's more than the brain that will lead you to a point of trusting the testimony about the resurrection.